In 2025, it feels like the entire world is constantly on fire. Political turbulence keeps crashing down on us like it's the 1920s all over again. From Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Armenia Azerbaijan border crisis to the never ending war between Israel and Palestine that has persisted since their inception, recent events make it feel like decades have passed in just a few short years. This year, we've also seen something completely unprecedented: a Gen Z protest in Nepal that actually voted their interim prime minister through Discord, of all things. Apparently, being a Discord mod is now a legitimate form of political leadership experience. It can be exhausting to keep up with international politics. The news keeps bombarding us with groundbreaking updates, causing fatigue. However, I'd argue that we should keep paying attention to political events and take action when necessary. For example, not investing in China during the Trump administration, or maybe not pushing freedom of speech too hard in the UK these days. Unfortunately, that's not sarcasm. Things have just gotten weird there recently. I know George Orwell was from the United Kingdom too, but I doubt he wanted his book to be recreated in real life. Someone really needs to remind the UK government that 1984 was a warning, not a guidebook. Even if you're far from ground zero, that doesn't mean the political landscape won't affect you. People in Western Europe might not face the risk of a surprise special military operation by Russia, but that invasion has caused major shifts in the economic and political landscape. At first, energy prices spiked dramatically as Russia squeezed supply to pressure the EU. Electricity bills for ordinary people skyrocketed like they were under hyperinflation, and European governments were shocked that a nation with a long history of invading its neighbors actually invaded its neighbor again. In response, governments scrambled to build additional LNG facilities. Suddenly, cheap Russian gas was out, and American and Qatari LNG was in. For Europeans, the peace dividend was nice while it lasted. But now, with shock therapy in full display, NATO nations have committed to rearming, possibly straining budgets that once supported strong social welfare systems. That 5% GDP defense commitment isn't small, and it's bound to cause discomfort for ordinary citizens. Just because you don't care about geopolitics doesn't mean geopolitics doesn't care about you. Russia's actions in Ukraine aren't confined to the European continent. While Russia blockades Ukraine and Eastern Europe, ordinary citizens in Egypt, thousands of kilometers away, might go hungry because Ukrainian grain exports were blocked, causing food prices to soar. We've already seen food prices rise sharply after Russia's invasion, affecting the entire world. Rich nations in Western Europe or the US can withstand this. In fact, some might argue it's not the worst thing, since overeating causes more deaths than hunger there. But for nations in Africa or parts of Asia, these spikes in food and fuel prices can break entire economies. With food prices soaring up to 40% above their baseline in early 2021, it's not an exaggeration to say the war may have indirectly killed people on other continents as a side effect. Of course, not everyone ended up in a bad position. China and India, Russia's so-called friends, didn't stay silent. They helped by taking advantage of Western sanctions to buy cheap Russian crude oil, then reselling refined products back to Russia at a markup. Truly, a friendship without limits seems to have unlimited ways to screw over your own partner. There are a lot of people on the internet who are interested in politics, but unwilling to participate, to make their voices heard, or even to vote. Many think that whatever happens in other parts of the world isn't their problem, and that locally, whoever gets elected next term won't change anything anyway. I'd argue that this kind of thinking is misguided. Take a real-world example. After the 2025 US presidential election, there was a massive meltdown from the left. You don't have to look far to find it. There were countless Democrats crying like the world was ending the moment Trump took office again. If voting didn't actually matter, these people wouldn't even react that way. Their reaction shows there's something they really didn't want, something that happened because Trump was elected. The point is, voting matters. Politics matters. What happens in the Capitol affects even the smallest villages on the edge of a border. So today, I want to talk about what politics really is. Let's start with the basics. Its definition. What exactly is politics? What kinds of political systems exist and how do they distribute power? Different political systems distribute power and wealth in different ways. Oil-rich Middle Eastern countries, or kingdoms, since some of them are still technically absolute monarchies, keep their citizens quiet with oil money. It turns out the easiest way to silence a population while committing atrocities is to simply bribe them. Other political and economic systems, like communism, promise that wealth and power will be distributed equally among all people. But in practice, it doesn't really work that way. Capitalism, not exactly a political system, but closely tied to one, is also a way to distribute power. It promises that those who work hard will be rewarded with good money, while the lazy will be left behind. In reality, though, what we often get is trickle-up economics. Now, about forms of government. Despite living in 2025, the world still has systems you'd expect from medieval times. Absolute monarchies and theocracies that operate pretty much the same as they did 1,000 years ago, only now with social media and Zoom meetings. Then there are the familiar systems, parliamentary republics, presidential systems, and constitutional monarchies. And let's not forget the lesser discussed ones, military juntas or regions where the government is barely defined, like the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Finally, why should we care about politics? Just because you don't care who gets elected doesn't mean you won't be affected by the tax rate that person proposes. Taxes, regulations, immigration policies, they're all politics. Changes in government policy can make or break your job or your business. By paying attention to what the government says and does, you can avoid bad decisions, like thinking it's a great idea to launch a DEI program during a Trump administration. So what is politics? The word itself comes from the ancient Greek politika, meaning affairs of the cities. But politics existed long before the Greeks. Even hunter-gatherer tribes had politics. If a tribe leader liked one guy and that guy hated another, the leader might discriminate against that person. That's politics in its simplest form. So how can we define politics concisely? In my opinion, the simplest way to describe it is this. Politics is how resources are distributed, how they're collected, and who decides what we do as a collective. Every system has its own way of distributing power. How much political power an average person has depends on the system and the era. For example, a modern citizen in today's France has far more political power than an average peasant in the old Kingdom of France. After all, voting is now for everyone. But that doesn't mean people always gain more power as time goes on. In the past, Chinese subjects couldn't choose their provincial governor or emperor. In the modern era, they still can't, thanks to the Chinese Communist Party. Still, in general, governments today are less able to ignore the will of the people than in the past. Even North Korea has to constantly brainwash its citizens to maintain control or risk a full-blown revolution. Before states as we know them existed, there were chiefdoms, or, if you want to be simplistic, tribal societies. Power was often concentrated in the hands of a tribal chief and his confidants. However, at this stage, individual autonomy among tribe members was still quite high. The chief might have been the boss, but he was also vulnerable, just another person who could be poked with sticks like everyone else. In such close-knit communities, it was nearly impossible for any leader to exercise absolute power. This changed once tribes grew into larger communities of thousands. They developed social hierarchies, nobles who didn't work in agriculture, elders who acted as living libraries of generational knowledge, and sometimes even tiered systems of leadership depending on the complexity of the chiefdom. The Cherokee, for example, had a royal family-like ruling system for a period of time. Other civilizations across the world, in India, China, and Africa, developed different systems depending on their local cultures. At this stage, political power was still relatively dispersed, and individuals retained a lot of autonomy. People mostly looked after themselves while contributing to the community. Formal laws didn't always exist, and an individual's personal strength or influence often determined their position in society. Then came the rise of states. Chiefdoms didn't disappear overnight when humans stopped being nomadic and began building cities. Instead, early states evolved from chiefdoms. As populations grew, societies became more complex. One leader could no longer oversee everything, so they had to delegate, assigning roles for enforcing laws, performing rituals, collecting resources, and managing daily life. This era gave rise to civilizations like ancient Egypt and Sumer. Early kingdoms formed, and rulers, often kings or god kings, now had to justify their authority. Why should people follow them? Why should they pay taxes or go to war when ordered? The answer, more often than not, was religion. Leaders claimed to be representatives of the gods or even their descendants. It became natural for common people to obey divine rulers. In Egypt, the monarch served as the supreme leader, the pharaoh. Interestingly, the term pharaoh wasn't actually used by Egyptians until around 1300 BC, according to archaeological evidence. Historians later applied it retroactively to describe Egypt's rulers up until their annexation by the Roman Empire. The pharaoh was seen as an intermediary between gods and humans, meaning that obeying him and paying taxes wasn't just expected, it was sacred duty. In Sumer, things are murkier. We know far less about their exact political organization. Were they a collection of city-states, a monarchy with kings, or a system similar to Egypt's divine rulers? The evidence isn't clear. What we do know is that positions like the priest-king existed, suggesting religion still played a major role in governance. Commerce was also surprisingly advanced during the Sumerian period. We even have the earliest known example of a customer complaint, the famous tablet to Ea Nasir. A buyer named Nani complained that the merchant Ea Nasir had supplied him with substandard copper ingots. When your service is so bad that someone carves a complaint into a clay tablet for eternity, you've probably done something wrong. It's proof that bad customer service and the urge to complain about it are truly timeless. At this point in history, political power began concentrating in the hands of the ruling class. Kings, pharaohs, and god kings wielded near absolute control. Wealth accumulation started translating directly into political power. Paying more taxes, or more importantly, bribing people in power, greased the political machine. The rich got richer, and influence over policy became a privilege of the elite. Thus, a ruling class emerged and began to dominate. Next came ancient Greece, the birthplace of much of Western philosophy and political thought. Greek thinkers focused on reason and inquiry. While not the first civilization to do so, their philosophy laid the groundwork for modern Western ideas. Democracy, social contracts, communism, the rule of law, and logical thinking all trace their roots here. In ancient Greece, the city-state system was the norm. There was no single empire uniting them. Instead, city-states formed and dissolved alliances depending on their leaders, wealth, and necessity. This was also where democracy was first widely practiced and formalized as a method of political decision-making. In Athenian democracy, all eligible citizens could speak and vote in the assembly that created laws for the city-state. Political power shifted, at least partially, toward ordinary citizens, though the definition of citizen was extremely limited. Women were excluded, as were slaves, foreigners, and anyone below military age. Not that the U.S. did much better. Women only gained the right to vote after the 19th Amendment in 1920. While some power was extended to citizens, wealth and charisma still held sway. A wealthy populist could rally support and seize power, becoming a tyrant. Still, this was one of the first times in history when average male citizens had meaningful political influence, the power to vote directly on laws. Few modern states allow that level of direct democracy today. Moving on, we arrive at the Roman Empire. By this point, the political landscape had matured for the classical era. A complex social structure was firmly in place, with slaves at the bottom and patricians, the Roman version of nobility, at the top. In early Roman history, the emperor served as both the head of the state religion and the supreme commander of the military. The Senate functioned as the legislative body and held the real authority in lawmaking. Political power, however, was mostly in the hands of the wealthy. Yes, eligible citizens could still vote in assemblies, but the richer you were, the more votes you had. Literally. Imagine if Bob next door had 1 vote, but Trump had 69. Good luck passing any law that reduces wealth inequality when the rich can simply outvote the poor. Women were finally recognized as full citizens, protected under the law, just without the voting rights, of course. Next, we jump to the medieval era, which mainly concerns Europe. Chinese dynasties operated on an entirely different system based on Confucian teachings. So different, in fact, that they deserve a separate discussion altogether. Feudalism revolved around the relationships between lords, vassals, fiefs, and peasants. A lord granted land, a fief, to a vassal, who in turn oversaw peasants working the land. Peasants had almost no political rights, and nearly all political power rested in the hands of lords, vassals, and the clergy. In some cases, peasants couldn't even leave the land they worked. Ironically, citizens in ancient Greece and Rome had more political power than people under feudalism. After the Black Death wiped out much of Europe's population, peasants gained slightly more power. The labor shortage forced nobles to pay them real wages, allowing them to pursue education and improve their quality of life. This system eventually faded with industrialization. Now we've arrived in the modern era. Throughout history, power has kept concentrating. The powerful grow more powerful, and the rich grow richer, often at the expense of ordinary people. But don't worry. Humanity eventually came up with the ultimate system, one that promised equality for everyone, providing according to each person's needs. No more landlords hoarding all the land and capital while paying workers peanuts. No more concentration of political power in the hands of the few. No more oppression of the common citizen. While those stinky Westerners promoted capitalism and deepened wealth inequality, this system promised fairness and equality. Welcome to communism. In theory, there's no private property. People work for the community, and in return, the community provides for everyone. Which is why the USSR and Mao Zedong's China became the epitome of equality, where the people had the most power. Just kidding. In reality, political power was once again concentrated in the hands of a few elites, while ordinary citizens who spoke up simply disappeared. The irony is staggering. The system that promised the most equality ended up being one of the worst offenders in unequal power distribution. In comparison, modern Western capitalist nations provide more political rights to their citizens. You can speak up without being arrested. Well, except in the UK recently, for some reason. I'm not sure what they're planning, but rolling back freedom of speech on certain issues isn't exactly a 5D chess move. Still, even with more rights, the conclusion remains the same. Political power is mainly held by the elite, the rich and powerful. Take Amazon, for example. It employs so many people that the government can't push too hard against it, because doing so would mean massive job losses and lost votes. Too big to fail isn't just an economic term, it's political too. If such a company collapsed, it would drag everyone down with it. For ordinary people, exercising political rights has become standardized. Protest, vote, and speak freely. And if the system fails, well, there's always the option of a full-blown riot if you're willing to risk getting shot. Western nations haven't seen large-scale protests lately, but other countries have. Nepal and Madagascar, for example, have shown how much power ordinary citizens can wield when they unite. There's a reason even modern dictatorships like Russia and China don't oppress their citizens too harshly anymore. It's safer to just brainwash them instead. Now let's talk about the forms of government. Even though the US, Germany, the UK, and France are all democracies, they each have very different ways of running their governments. Just having a voting system doesn't mean every democracy works the same way. I mean, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, aka North Korea, literally has democratic in its name. But no one seriously believes North Korean citizens have any say in what their government does. Unless, of course, you believe Kim Jong-un is so universally adored that he legitimately earns 120% of the votes every election. In modern nations, we generally expect a separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. How a country divides and balances those powers determines its system of government. Of course, some countries like to ignore that expectation entirely and cosplay as nations straight out of Europa Universalis 4. Let's start with constitutional monarchies, one of the more common forms of government in Europe. The UK, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all fall under this category, along with others like Japan, Jordan, Malaysia, and Thailand. Some of these nations even retain their old nobility systems, complete with dukes, counts, and barons. However, in these countries, the monarchs themselves hold little to no real power. In places like the UK or Japan, they mostly serve ceremonial roles. People often ask, why keep this system? Why not just abolish the monarchy altogether? The answer is simple. There's no real reason to. King Charles III doesn't actually have any political authority. He can't order the House of Commons to pass new laws, so why bother removing him? Besides, the UK now treats the monarchy as part of its cultural heritage, a sort of living monument. Who says a national symbol has to be made of stone? The British monarch is basically a royal mascot. Think of it as a historical landmark that waves back. Next, we have the OGs, the absolute monarchies, a system that has survived since the classical era. Whatever the king says, goes. In this category, we have countries like Saudi Arabia, Brunei, and Oman. In these systems, there are no political parties, no opposition, and certainly no elections that matter. Why would anyone oppose the king anyway? We love the king. If he wants you gone, you're gone. Just ask Jamal Khashoggi. However, even absolute monarchs don't hold unlimited power anymore. They maintain control through a simple but effective method, bribing their own citizens. The average Russian might tolerate Putin's rule because of cheap gas. Meanwhile, in Saudi Arabia, citizens are paid around $3,000 a month for doing very little as government employees, with other benefits and almost no taxes. Under those conditions, why would anyone complain? These monarchies are propped up by oil money, but that wealth isn't infinite. It's an unsustainable system, and how they evolve will depend on how they eventually collapse. Then there's the parliamentary republic, where the executive branch derives its legitimacy from the parliament. In this system, the legislative branch holds the most power. Examples include Germany, Greece, Italy, Finland, and India. The head of government is usually a prime minister, chosen by the parliament, which itself is elected by the people. There are also hybrid parliamentary systems that include an executive president, though these are rare, existing in only a few countries such as Guyana, Botswana, and South Africa. Next, we have the presidential system, where citizens directly elect their head of state, the president. Examples include Brazil, Indonesia, El Salvador, and the United States. Of course, Americans don't technically vote for the president directly. They vote for members of the Electoral College, who then cast the actual votes. That's why winning the popular vote doesn't always mean winning the election. Still, since the Electoral College usually reflects the outcome of party line voting, the US is categorized as a presidential system. And believe it or not, Russia is also officially a presidential system. They even have elections. The most recent one showed Vladimir Putin winning 88% of the vote, a truly inspiring display of democracy. I'm sure the counting process was completely legitimate and totally free from manipulation. Finally, let's look at the systems that still exist but are no longer mainstream. In a theocracy, religious leaders rule as intermediaries between humans and God. Current examples include the Vatican, Iran, and Afghanistan. After taking back power from the US-backed government, the Taliban decided to, how shall we put it, return to form, declaring the Second Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan under strict Sharia law. Apparently, nostalgia isn't just for gamers. It's for militant groups too. Then there are military juntas, where the military itself is the government. In a civilian government, if you disagree with an order, you can refuse or face legal consequences. In a military junta, refusal isn't an option, because when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. When you have the guns and the civilians don't obey, let's just say the outcome isn't pretty. Current examples include Burkina Faso, Mali, Sudan, and Myanmar since its military takeover. Lastly, we have non-state actors like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and ISIS. They aren't governments in the traditional sense, but they do control territory. They have leaders, senior members, and lower-ranking subordinates. They don't hold elections, and the people living under them have virtually no rights. They rule through violence, not legitimacy. They may provide utilities or basic administration, but without formal institutions or accountability, it's hard to call them true governments. After knowing all this, does caring about politics really matter? We've seen that in every system. Power always ends up concentrated in the hands of the elite. Even in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, where citizens, excluding women, could vote directly on laws, the wealthy still held more power than the average person. Systems that promise equality, like communism, fall into the same trap. Humans may be equal, but some are always more equal than others. People in power will always want more power, no matter what the political system looks like. The rich will get richer, And even if a revolution wipes out one generation of oligarchs, a new breed will eventually take their place. The cycle repeats. Despite all of this, I'd still argue that you should care. Just look at the US election results. In 2020, Biden received around 81 million votes. In 2024, however, Kamala Harris only got about 71 million, nearly a 10 million vote drop. Meanwhile, Trump increased his total by almost a million compared to 2020. Democrats who didn't show up to vote were the main reason Trump won again. And judging by how unhinged and apocalyptic the left acted when Trump won, again, it's clear that voting really does matter. If it didn't, we wouldn't have the spectacle of a meme president leading the most powerful country on earth. Whether that's good or bad is debatable, but the fact remains, votes are counted, and Trump, as president, behaves very differently from Biden or Kamala. That's the US. But what about other nations? Voting still matters, I'd argue. Take Germany. When the AfD, a right-wing conservative party, started gaining votes, the political establishment panicked and formed coalitions to keep the far right out of power. That alone shows that votes matter. If they didn't, the establishment wouldn't bother reacting. I mean, if you hand your little brother a PS5 controller that's not plugged in, you don't care what buttons he presses. Now let's look at this from a politician's perspective. You're the president of a country, lucky enough to have won the last election. After years in office, you've managed the economy, maintained foreign relations, rewarded your supporters, and maybe even picked up an extra mansion along the way. Hey, every job comes with perks, right? Especially when you can sign your own bonus. But as your term ends, things start going south. The economy's collapsing, corruption scandals are everywhere, people are losing jobs, and public anger is rising. Oh no, you still want to win re-election. You've been eyeing that Russian yacht being sold off after another oligarch fell out of a window. From your perspective, it's great if the population becomes apathetic toward politics. Sure, they're angry, jobless, and suffering under inflation. But as long as they don't vote or protest, their anger means nothing. Your supporters, the ones you've benefited, will still show up to vote. Your opposition won't gain votes from people who stay home. Non-voters, in this case, are effectively giving free power to the current government. By not voting, they hand the ruling class more legitimacy. The opposition might be just as corrupt, but when people do vote, politicians are at least forced to try to please them. Maybe instead of stealing enough money for 2 mansions, they settle for 1. Still corrupt, sure, but less corrupt. It's an imperfect system, but voting gives people the leverage to hold politicians somewhat accountable. Nations with low voter turnout tend to be more corrupt because their politicians know the public won't punish them at the polls. Without consequences, the ruling elite does whatever it wants. Haiti, Nigeria, Tunisia, and Mali all have voter turnouts under 40%, and none of them are exactly models of transparency or competence. In my opinion, every eligible person should vote. Even if you think both sides are corrupt, vote for the less bad one. And if that still doesn't work for you, vote randomly. Just by casting your vote, you're sending a message to the ruling class. The people are paying attention. That signal alone forces them to act more cautiously, to hide their corruption, at the very least. Maybe they go from 2 mansions to 1. Still bad, but better than the alternative. I hope with this video I've encouraged you to care a little more about politics, to pay attention to what's happening in the world, and to get involved in your local politics. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.